He expected a black-edged letter informing him of his wife's demise, a quiet conclusion to a distasteful but necessary chapter of his life. He had, after all, purchased a sickly bride and banished her to a rotting estate on the bleakest edge of his duchy, a place known to swallow hope and health in equal measure. He did not expect to return years later, a man hollowed out by war and politics, to find the gates repaired. He did not expect to see smoke curling from a dozen chimneys, or to smell baking bread instead of damp decay. He did not expect to find the woman he had sent to die not merely alive, but magnificent, ruling a thriving kingdom she had carved from the heart of his neglect. And he certainly did not expect that in the ruins of his own life, she would be the one to offer him a home. The solicitor's office smelled of dust and decaying paper, a scent Alastair, the Duke of Blackwood, found fitting. It was the smell of endings, of things filed away and forgotten. He stood by the tall, grimy window, his gaze fixed on the London street below, where the rain fell in a relentless, gray sheet, washing the world clean of color and warmth. It was a day for transactions, not celebrations. His presence here was a duty, another box to be ticked on a list that stretched into an oppressive infinity. The crown demanded stability. His title demanded an heir. His neglected northern estate, Graymore, required a duchess in residence to satisfy the terms of a long-dead ancestor's bizarre will, lest the lands revert to a distant, grasping cousin. He had no time for a courtship, no stomach for the simpering debutantes of the season. He had just returned from the continent, the thunder of cannons still a phantom echo in his ears, the faces of dead men etched behind his eyes. He needed a wife who would not require his time, his attention, or his affection. He needed a wife who would be content to be exiled, to be forgotten. He needed a solution, not a partner. His solicitor, Mr. Barrows, a man whose spine seemed to have been permanently bent over legal tomes, had found one. A Miss Alara Vance, an orphan, a paid companion to a harridan of an aunt who was desperate to be rid of her. Most importantly, she was delicate. The word the solicitor had used was frail, but the meaning was clear. She possessed a persistent cough, a constitution weakened by a childhood of poverty and illness. She was, in the cold calculus of their arrangement, unlikely to be a long-term inconvenience. She would serve her purpose, satisfy the residency clause of the Graymore inheritance, and then, it was tactfully unsaid but universally understood, she would fade away. He turned from the window as the door creaked open. Barrows scurried in, followed by two women. The first was plump and florid, her gown a garish explosion of purple silk that was far too fine for her station and far too tight for her frame. Her eyes, small and sharp, darted around the room, assessing the value of the worn furniture before landing on him. A greedy, sycophantic smile stretched her lips. This was the aunt, Sophronia. Behind her, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Alara Vance. She was taller than he had expected, and impossibly slender, lost within a gown of washed-out gray wool that had clearly seen better decades. Her hair, a plain brown, was scraped back into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale, her features fine-boned, but unremarkable save for her eyes. They were a startling, lucid gray, and they met his for a brief, unnerving moment. There was no fear in them. No, only a flat, assessing calm that mirrored his own. Then a dry, rasping cough shook her thin frame, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, breaking the contact. The moment of strength, if it had ever existed, was gone. She was exactly as advertised, a fragile commodity. "Your Grace," the aunt gushed, executing a clumsy curtsy that sent a puff of stale lavender into the air. "Such an honor, an overwhelming honor. My dear Alara is quite overcome." Alastair's gaze flickered to the girl. She did not look overcome. She looked as though she were waiting for a bus. His eyes were drawn to the worn, mended state of her gloves, the faint ink stain on her right index finger. A reader, a letter writer, a woman with an inner life he had no interest in exploring. "Let us conclude this," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. It was the voice he used with insubordinate officers and tedious politicians. Barrows flinched and gestured them towards the large mahogany desk. The documents were already laid out. Alistair remained standing, a silent, imposing figure in black, his broad shoulders seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the grimy window. He watched as Alara took her seat. She moved with a quiet economy, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not look at him. She did not look at her aunt. Her attention was fixed on the papers, her lucid eyes scanning the dense legal text. "A simple matter," Barrows began, his voice nervously high. "The marriage agreement. His Grace has been most generous. A settlement for you, madam," he nodded at Sophronia, who practically vibrated with anticipation. "And of course, the full rights and titles of a duchess for Miss Vance, including residence at the ancestral seat of Graymore." Graymore. The name fell into the dusty silence like a stone into a stagnant pond. Alistair thought of the reports. A rotting tooth of a manor in the dampest, most forgotten corner of Northumberland. Overgrown, understaffed, and bleeding money. A tomb. It was the perfect place. Alara's head lifted. "The full rights?" she asked, her voice surprisingly clear, though quiet. "Does that include dispensation of the estate's accounts and management of its staff and properties?" Barrows blinked, taken aback. "Well, yes, in principle. Of course, His Grace's stewards would handle any significant matters. But the authority is mine," she pressed, not looking at Alistair, but speaking into the space he occupied. "Legally, if I were to, for instance, dismiss the housekeeper or sell a parcel of fallow land to pay for a new roof, I would have the authority to do so." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Alistair's lips. It was a cold, cruel thing. Let her play at being a duchess in her crumbling castle. Let her sign papers and give orders to the 2 deaf servants and the groundsmen who likely still resided there. It would keep her occupied. "You will have absolute authority at Graymore," he stated, his voice cutting through Barrow's stammering. "The estate is yours to manage as you see fit. It is of no interest to me." For the first time since she had entered the room, she turned her head and looked directly at him. Her gaze was unervingly direct. It was not the gaze of a grateful orphan being saved from penury. It was the gaze of a fellow signatory to a contract, a co-conspirator in a mutually beneficial deception. "I see," she said softly, and he had the distinct impression that she did. Her aunt shot her a venomous look, a silent command to be quiet, to be grateful, to not ruin this. But Alara had already turned back to the papers. She picked up the quill, dipped it in the ink pot, and with a steady hand, signed her name. Alara Vance. The script was neat, precise, and utterly without flourish. Alistair signed his own name with a few sharp, angry strokes. Blackwood. It was done. The aunt was paid off, her sycophantic gratitude grating on his already frayed nerves. She departed without so much as a backward glance at the niece she had just sold. Alistair was left in the dusty office with the woman who was now his wife, his duchess. "A carriage will be ready in an hour," he said, not looking at her. "It will take you to Graymore. You are not accompanying me." "No." He finally turned to face her. "I have matters in London that require my attention. The journey is long. You will be provided for." She simply nodded, her pale face impassive. She stood, her slight frame seeming to brace itself. "And what are my instructions, Your Grace?" Once I arrive, he felt a surge of irritation. He did not want to think about her. He did not want to think about Graymore. He wanted this transaction to be over. He had bought her, and now he wanted to put her away on a shelf and forget she existed. "My instructions," he said, stepping closer, his height and bulk deliberately intimidating, "are that you inconvenience me as little as possible. Live there, die there. It is of no consequence to me. You are the Duchess of Blackwood in name and residence only. Do not write to me. Do not trouble me with the estate's trivialities. Do not, under any circumstances, return to London. Am I understood?" He had expected her to flinch, to lower her eyes, to show some sign of fear or hurt. She did not. She held his gaze, and for a fleeting, infuriating second, he saw not a sickly girl but a piece of tempered steel. "Perfectly," she replied, her voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "You have purchased my name and my presence on a specific piece of land. You have not purchased my obedience in any other matter. I will manage my household as I see fit. And I assure you, Your Grace, you are the very last person on this earth I would ever trouble." Then she coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that broke the spell. Her shoulders hunched, and the formidable woman vanished, replaced once more by the frail creature he had acquired. She turned away, pulling her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. He watched her for a moment, a strange and unwelcome emotion stirring in his chest. It was not pity. It was something closer to annoyance. Annoyance that she was not as simple as she appeared, that this neat, tidy solution might have a complication he had not foreseen. Then he dismissed it. She was a dying girl being sent to a dying house. What complication could she possibly be? Alara sat alone in the carriage. The word alone had been the defining characteristic of her life, yet this solitude felt different. It was not the loneliness of being an unwanted presence in another's home, but the stark, absolute isolation of a parcel being shipped to a distant, unknown address. The Duke of Blackwood had not spoken another word to her. He had simply gestured to the waiting carriage, a black, lacquered box that looked for all the world like a hearse, and then turned his back, disappearing into the gray mauve London. The journey north was a descent. The manicured fields and bustling towns of the south gradually gave way to rougher, emptier country. The roads worsened, the sky grew heavier, and the rain, which had been a persistent drizzle in London, became a driving, relentless assault. The world outside her window was a watercolor painting left out in a storm, all blurred greens and running browns. The carriage wheels churned through mud that seemed determined to suck them down into the earth itself. Cold seeped through the floorboards, a damp, insidious chill that settled deep in her bones and aggravated the familiar fire in her lungs. She did not allow herself to weep. Tears were a luxury she had never been able to afford. Instead, she focused on the facts, arranging them in her mind like a set of cold, hard stones. Fact 1. She was no longer Alara Vance, penniless companion. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt absurd, a costume she was wearing, but it was a legal reality. Fact 2. She was free of her Aunt Sophronia, whose cloying perfume and casual cruelty had been the twin tortures of her existence. This was a monumental victory. Fact 3. She had been given a house. A decaying, remote, money pit of a house, by all accounts, but it was hers. Her authority, he had said, the first authority she had ever possessed in her 23 years of life. The final fact was the one she kept pushing away, the one that whispered in the rhythm of the rattling carriage and the drumming rain. She had been sent there to die. He had said it with his eyes, with the cold finality of his tone. Live there, die there, is of no consequence to me. It was not a sentence of malice, so much as one of utter indifference. She was a piece of administrative debris he had swept into the most distant corner of his life. The carriage lurched to a halt, throwing her against the worn leather seat. After a long moment of shouting and the sucking sound of wheels being freed from mud, it crawled forward again, slower this time. They were climbing. The landscape grew wilder, more desolate. Gnarled, skeletal trees clawed at a sky the color of slate. Great, brooding hills loomed on either side, their faces slick with rain and streaked with the dark veins of nascent streams. There was a profound and unnerving silence beneath the noise of the weather, the silence of a place that had long been abandoned by man and God. It was nearly dusk when the driver finally called out, "Graymore, Your Grace." Alara leaned forward, wiping the condensation from the window with her gloved hand. Her first sight of her new home was of a gate, or rather, what was left of one. A single, massive iron gate, rusted and half devoured by ivy, hung drunkenly from a granite pillar. Its counterpart lay twisted and broken in the overgrown ditch beside the road. Beyond it, a long, winding drive disappeared into a tunnel of dark, menacing trees. The carriage passed through the broken gateway and began its slow, final approach. The drive was a nightmare of potholes and encroaching wilderness. Branches, heavy with rain, scraped and clawed at the roof of the carriage like skeletal fingers. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and something else, the deep, pervasive scent of mildew and decay. It was the smell of a house that had given up. And then she saw it. Graymore. It did not rise so much as it slumped against the bruised evening sky. It was a vast, sprawling edifice of gray stone, stained black in jagged streaks by centuries of rain. It was a chaotic jumble of architectural styles. A Tudor wing here, a Georgian facade there, a grim, tower-like structure that seemed almost medieval. Windows were boarded up. Slates were missing from the roof, leaving dark, gaping wounds. Ivy consumed entire walls, its tendrils probing at the mortar like insidious green fingers searching for a way to pull the whole thing down. It was not a house. It was a geological feature, a man-made mountain in the process of being reclaimed by the wild. It was a tomb. The carriage pulled to a stop before a set of massive oak doors. They were bleached and splintered. No lights shone in any of the visible windows. No smoke rose from the legion of chimneys. The Duke's words echoed in her mind. "It is of no consequence to me." He had not been exaggerating. The coachman, a grim-faced man who had not spoken a word to her for 300 miles, opened the door. A blast of cold, damp air filled the carriage. "This is it, then," he said, not meeting her eye. He gestured for a single, small trunk to be unloaded and deposited it on the top step, where it looked pitiful and lost. Alara gathered her shawl and her dignity and stepped out of the carriage. The rain had softened to a mist, but it was a cold, wetting mist that clung to her clothes and hair. She stood on the stone steps, a lone, slender figure in gray, and looked up at the monstrous facade of her new home. A profound sense of despair, cold and heavy as the house itself, threatened to crush her. This was not a home. This was a grave, and she had been delivered to it. The carriage door slammed shut. The driver climbed back onto his box without a backward glance. With a crack of the whip and a squelch of mud, the carriage began to turn, its purpose fulfilled. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, was a man of his word. He had not looked back. He had delivered her to her place of exile, and now he was leaving her there. She stood alone in the deepening twilight, the mist swirling around her ankles. The carriage disappeared down the dark, tree-lined drive, its rattling sound fading until all that was left was the drip of water from the eaves and the mournful sigh of the wind through the broken slates. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. For a long, frozen moment, she did nothing. She simply stood in the mud and the rain, a powerless survivor facing a hostile house. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the neglect, of the abandonment, was a physical blow. He had not just sent her away. He had sent her to this monument to decay. A wave of fury, white-hot and pure, surged through her, momentarily burning away the cold. How dare he? How dare he be so casually cruel, so utterly dismissive of her existence? The fury gave way to a chilling resolve. He expected her to die. Her aunt expected her to die. The house itself seemed to expect her to die. She would not. Drawing a breath of the cold, damp air that made her lungs ache, Alara turned her back on the departing carriage and the world that had discarded her. She walked up the remaining steps, her worn boots making no sound on the moss-slick stone, and raised her hand to the great iron door knocker. It was shaped like a snarling wolf's head, its surface pitted with rust. It was heavy and cold beneath her fingers. With all the strength she possessed, she lifted it and brought it down against the door. The sound was immense, a hollow, booming clang that echoed, as if into a vast and empty cavern. It sounded less like a request for entry and more like a declaration of war. A full minute passed. The echo of the knocker died, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. Alara waited, her hand still resting on the cold iron, the mist dampening her hair and the shoulders of her thin shawl. She was beginning to think no one was home at all, that the Duke had sent her to a truly abandoned place when she heard the sound. A scraping, dragging noise from within, the sound of multiple heavy bolts being drawn back with grudging reluctance. The door did not open. It cracked, a sliver of deeper darkness in the gloom, held fast by a thick security chain. In the crack, a face appeared. It was a woman, old and severe, her face a roadmap of disapproval. Her gray hair was pulled back, so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her eyes, dark and suspicious, raked over Alara from head to toe, taking in the cheap wool dress, the dampness, the air of weary defiance. "The house is closed," the woman said, her voice as rusty as the door chain. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood," Alara stated, her own voice quiet but firm. She held up her left hand, where the plain gold band Alistair had slid onto her finger in the solicitor's office felt like a foreign object. "Open the door." The woman's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something, contempt, disbelief, crossed her face. "We've had no word of a duchess." A failure of communication on the Duke's part, not a failure of fact on mine, Alara countered, her patience, already worn thin by the journey, beginning to fray. His Grace was preoccupied. "Now, you will open this door, or I will have this carriage driver, who is still within earshot, fetch the magistrate from the nearest town to witness my legal entry. I assure you, the Duke would be far more displeased by that public spectacle than by your adherence to his wife's command. It was a bluff. The carriage was long gone, but it was delivered with an unshakable certainty." The woman stared at her for another long moment. Then, with a sniff of profound disapproval, she slammed the door shut. Alara heard the chain being rattled free, and then the door swung inward on groaning hinges, revealing a hall of breathtaking darkness and scale. The air that rolled out was a physical presence. It was colder than the air outside, and it carried the complex olfactory signature of a place long surrendered to time. Cold ash from 1,000 dead fires, the musty sweetness of mildew, the sharp tang of mouse droppings, and the ghostly scent of old, damp paper. The hall was cavernous, the ceiling lost in shadows far above. Furniture stood in ghostly lumps under white dust cloths, looking like a congregation of shrouded giants. A grand staircase, wide enough for a dozen people to walk abreast, swept up into the oppressive gloom. "I am Mrs. Gable," the old woman announced, her tone making it clear she was the undisputed ruler of this dead kingdom. "Housekeeper." "A pleasure," Alara lied smoothly. "You will have my trunk brought in and a fire lit in my room. I require hot water and something to eat." Mrs. Gable's thin lips tightened. "The fires are not lit in the staterooms. The west wing is closed. You'll be in the east nursery suite. It is prepared." The way she said prepared suggested it was prepared for a long and miserable illness. Alara's trunk was dragged inside by a stooped, ancient man who appeared out of the shadows and vanished just as quickly. Mrs. Gable then led the way, not with a lamp, but trusting her own familiarity with the darkness. Alara followed, her hand trailing along a wall that was shockingly cold and damp to the touch. They passed through archways into corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity, the only sound the rustle of Mrs. Gable's skirts and the soft tap of Alara's own worn boots on the stone flags. The house was a labyrinth of cold and shadow. The east nursery suite was just as grim as the housekeeper's tone had promised. It consisted of a small sitting room and an adjoining bedroom. A meager fire had been lit in the bedroom grate, but it was a sullen, smoky thing that produced more gloom than warmth, its feeble light only serving to highlight the water stains on the ceiling and the faded, peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of cold ash and damp plaster. A narrow bed was covered with a thin, lumpy mattress and a collection of threadbare blankets. It was a room that actively worked against health and spirit. A tray was brought up later by a young, frightened-looking maid. It held a bowl of thin, greasy broth, a hunk of stale bread, and a jug of lukewarm water. It was food meant for an invalid, sustenance without pleasure, designed to keep one alive, but no more. Alara ate it without complaint. Complaining would be a sign of weakness, and she could not afford to show any. The days that followed blurred into a miserable, damp routine. Alara was confined to her cold, drafty rooms, her cough worsening into a deep, rattling affliction that left her weak and breathless. Mrs. Gable would appear once a day, her face a mask of grim satisfaction, to observe Alara's decline. The young maid, whose name she learned was Mary, would bring the same unappetizing meals, her eyes full of a pity that was almost as insulting as the housekeeper's contempt. Alara was a prisoner in her own house, tended to by indifferent staff who were clearly just waiting for her to fulfill their expectations and fail. She spent her time in bed, the damp cold of the sheets seeping into her marrow. She was sinking. The house, the weather, the profound isolation. They were a weight, pressing down on her, crushing the spark of defiance that had brought her to the door. Despair was a quiet, creeping thing, far more dangerous than the sharp pang of fury. It whispered to her in the long, dark nights, telling her that the Duke was right. This was her tomb. She had simply arrived a little early for her own burial. One morning, she awoke from a fitful, feverish sleep to the sound of rain lashing against the window pane. The fire had gone out, leaving the room frigid. A wave of coughing seized her, so violent it left her dizzy and gasping for air. As she lay back against the lumpy pillows, weak and trembling, she saw it. On the ceiling, directly above her bed, a new water stain had appeared overnight. It was a dark, spreading bloom of damp, and as she watched, a single, fat drop of water gathered, trembled, and fell. It landed on the thin blanket covering her chest with a soft, cold splat. Another drop gathered, and another. Drip, drip, drip. It was the most profound insult yet. The house itself was weeping onto her, trying to drown her in its own misery. She lay there, watching the drops fall, feeling the cold seep into her, and something inside her snapped. It was a moment of white-hot clarity, a furious, incandescent rage that burned through the fog of illness and despair. She was Alara Vance. She had survived a childhood of neglect, an adolescence of servitude, and the utter humiliation of being sold like chattel. She had faced down a Duke and his contempt. She would not be defeated by a leaking roof and a grim-faced housekeeper. He had told her to die. The world had told her to die. She would live, if only despite them all. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw back the damp blankets. Her legs were unsteady as she stood, the cold floor shocked to her bare feet. But she did not falter. She walked into the small sitting room where a fresh log had been placed beside the cold grate. She ignored it. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a small, spindly writing desk. On its surface were the estate ledgers, which she had requested on her second day, and which Mrs. Gable had delivered with a dismissive smirk, as if they were a child's toy. She had not had the strength to open them. Now she did. She sat down, pulled the heavy, leather-bound book towards her, and opened it. The pages were filled with cramped, spidery script, detailing decades of mismanagement and neglect. Expenses, losses, debts. It was a story of slow, inexorable decay. The door opened, and Mary entered with a morning tray of broth. The girl stopped short, her eyes wide with surprise at seeing Alara out of bed. "Your Grace," she stammered. "You should be resting." Alara did not look up from the ledger. "Move my things," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "Move them, Your Grace." "To this room," Alara tapped the ledger. "Move the bed in here. This fireplace draws properly. That one does not. The roof in the bedroom leaks. This one does not. I will sleep in here from now on." It was her first true command, a practical, defiant order. She had stopped acting like a dying woman and started acting like a living one. Mary hesitated, looking towards the door as if expecting Mrs. Gable to appear and countermand the order. Alara finally lifted her head. She looked at the terrified young maid, and her expression softened slightly. "Mary, this is my house now, and I will not die in a damp bed. Please help me." The simple please did what the command could not. Mary nodded, a flicker of resolve in her own eyes. Together, they wrestled the lumpy mattress off the bed frame. They dragged the heavy furniture across the floor. It was exhausting work, and by the end, Alara was leaning against the wall, her lungs screaming in protest. But as Mary built up a proper, roaring fire in the sitting room grate, a wave of triumphant warmth washed over her. It was not just the heat from the flames. It was the warmth of her own will rekindled. Later that day, when Mrs. Gable appeared for her daily inspection, she stopped dead in the doorway, her mouth falling slightly open. The sitting room had been transformed. The bed was made, the fire was blazing, and the Duchess was sitting at the desk, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the estate ledgers open before her, a pen in her hand. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice tight with disapproval. "What is the meaning of this?" Alara looked up, her lucid gray eyes meeting the older woman's. "The meaning, Mrs. Gable, is that I am cold, and I am making myself warm. I am in a house that is falling apart, and I am attempting to understand why. From now on, you will report to me here every morning at 9. You will bring the household accounts, the staff roster, and a pot of hot tea. Strong tea, not broth." She had drawn a line in the dust of the decaying house. The battle for Graymore had begun. The practical takeover of Graymore began not with a grand decree, but with a series of small, logical rebellions. Alara, now installed in her makeshift bedchamber, became the gravitational center of the dying house. The roaring fire in her grate was a beacon, a signal that a new and stubborn consciousness had taken root. She spent her first week of command poring over the ledgers, her ink-stained fingers tracing the paths of financial hemorrhage. The books told a bleak story, generations of absentee dukes, of stewards who were either incompetent or corrupt, of a slow, steady bleeding of resources with nothing to show for it, but accelerating decay. Every morning at 9, Mrs. Gable would appear, stiff with resentment, holding the household account books. Alara would go over them, her questions sharp and precise. "Why are we paying a pension to a groom who died 3 years ago? Why are we ordering silver polish when half the silver was sold off a decade ago? Who is Thomas Riggs? And why has he been paid for 50 tons of slate every year for the last 5 years when the roof is still full of holes?" The housekeeper's initial responses were defensive and evasive. "It is how it has always been done, Your Grace," but Alara's pragmatism was a relentless force. She did not care for tradition. She cared for solvency. She cross-referenced ledgers, circled discrepancies, and demanded answers. Slowly, grudgingly, Mrs. Gable's stonewalling began to crack. She was a woman who, for all her grimness, understood order. What she saw in the ledgers was chaos. What she saw in her new Duchess was a surprising and unsettling love of order. Alara's second act of rebellion was to leave her room. Wrapped in every shawl she owned, she began to explore the house. It was a daunting task. Graymore was a beast. She discovered entire wings that had been closed off for a century, their furniture still shrouded, the air perfectly preserved in its musty stillness. She found a ballroom where the floor had collapsed, revealing the dark, damp cellars below. She found a library where the books had turned to pulp and mushrooms grew in thick, pale clusters on the shelves. The sheer waste of it all offended her practical soul. She made a decision. Graymore was too large to be saved, but a part of it could be. She took a floor plan she had found in the study and a thick piece of charcoal from the hearth. With ruthless precision, she drew a red line. Everything west of the Great Hall was to be permanently sealed. The windows boarded, the doors locked. They would retreat, consolidate their meager resources into a defensible core: the kitchens, the servants' quarters, the east wing, and the study. To enact this plan, she needed more than a terrified maid and a resentful housekeeper. She needed the rest of the staff. She had Mrs. Gable assemble them in the cavernous, freezing kitchen. There were only 5 of them in total. Mrs. Gable, Mary the maid, the ancient man-of-all-work named Arthur, and a husband and wife team, the cooks, who were both well past retirement. They stood before her, a sad, skeletal crew, their expressions ranging from sullen to fearful. And then one more person entered, a man, tall and wiry, with a face weathered like an old boot and hands the size of shovels. He smelled of wet earth and cold air. He did not join the huddled staff, but stood by the door, his arms crossed, his gaze wary. "Mr. Thorne, the groundsman," Mrs. Gable supplied, her tone laced with disapproval as if he had tracked mud into her pristine mausoleum. Alara looked at him. He was the first person she had seen at Graymore who looked genuinely alive and strong. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, cold space. "I have been reviewing the accounts." A cynical smile touched the man's lips. "Have you now, Your Grace?" "I have," she continued, undeterred. "And I have a question. The estate has 3,000 acres. According to this ledger, 2,000 of those are leased to tenant farmers for a pittance. The remaining 1,000 are listed as fallow parkland. Is that accurate?" "Mostly," Thorne said, his gaze unwavering. "Except the tenants can barely scrape a living, so they're always behind on the rent. And the parkland is mostly bog and brambles." "I see." Alara paused, gathering her thoughts. "The house is rotting from the roof down. The staff is not being paid regularly. We are, to be blunt, bankrupt. This cannot continue." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. This was dangerous, unfamiliar territory. "I have a proposal," Alara said, her voice gaining strength. "We're going to save this house, or at least a part of it. We will close the west wing. We will use the wood from the collapsed ballroom floor to patch the roof over the kitchens. We will sell the ruined books from the library to a paper mill for pulp. We will sell the lead from the derelict chapel roof. We will use that money to buy seed and tools." She turned her attention fully to Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, that 1,000 acres of parkland, is any of it good for planting?" He considered this, his head tilted. "The south-facing slope behind the gardens. The soil's decent there. Drains well. We could clear maybe 20 acres before winter sets in." "Then that is what we will do," Alara declared. "We will create a market garden. A large one. We will grow vegetables for the house, and we will sell the surplus in the village. We will raise chickens. We will repair the greenhouses." A scoff came from Mrs. Gable. "Your Grace, we are the staff of a ducal household, not farm laborers." "Today, we are both," Alara said, her gray eyes flashing. "You have a choice. You can continue to preside over a dying house, receiving a wage that may or may not appear until the roof falls in on your heads. Or you can work with me to build something that will actually support us. A home that is warm and a kitchen that is full. The choice is yours, but I will not sit here and politely decay." She looked from face to face. She saw fear, doubt, ingrained deference warring with desperation. It was Thorne who broke the silence. He pushed himself off the wall and took a step forward. "The greenhouses," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The glass is mostly shattered. The frame is iron, though. It's sound, but it'll take a mountain of work." "Then we had best start," Alara replied. That was the turning point. Thorne's practical acceptance was the crack in the dam of apathy. He saw in her not a fragile duchess playing games, but a pragmatist just like him. His loyalty, which had belonged to the land itself, began to shift to the woman who was determined to save it. With Thorne on her side, the others, even the grumbling Mrs. Gable, fell into line. The weeks that followed were a blur of frantic, purposeful activity. Under Thorne's direction, Arthur and a hired man from the village began the brutal work of sealing the west wing. The sound of hammering echoed through the house, a sound of construction, not decay. Alara, armed with her ledger and a ruthless pen, found an asset, a collection of hideous porcelain figurines a previous duchess had collected. She had Thorne crate them up and send them to an auction house in York. The proceeds, a surprisingly handsome sum, paid for glass for the greenhouses and wages for 2 more hands. She worked alongside them. She was not strong, and her cough still troubled her in the damp air, but she was relentless. She spent hours in the walled garden, which had been choked with weeds, her hands raw from pulling them. She learned to sort seeds, to plan crop rotations, to distinguish between herbs for the kitchen and herbs for remedies. The physical work was exhausting, but it was also grounding. The scent of turned earth, of crushed rosemary and thyme, began to overlay the cloying smell of mildew. The house began to change. The kitchen, once a cold, forgotten cavern, became the heart of the operation. The great hearth was always lit, and the smell of baking bread, made from flour they could now afford to buy in bulk, filled the corridors. Mrs. Cook, revitalized by having a purpose and a well-stocked pantry, began to produce hearty stews and pies. Even Mrs. Gable seemed to thaw. One afternoon, Elara found the housekeeper in the laundry, vigorously scrubbing a set of curtains, a faint look of satisfaction on her severe face. The loyalty of the staff had not just shifted, it had solidified. They were no longer the Duke's servants. They were the Duchess's people. One crisp autumn evening, a year after her arrival, Elara stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The sun was setting, painting the brooding hills in shades of orange and purple. Below her, the first of the greenhouses stood repaired, its new glass gleaming. Beyond it, the 20 acres of cleared land lay in neat, dark furrows, ready for the spring planting. A curl of wood smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, carrying with it the scent of roasting meat. The house behind her felt, not warm, not yet, but alive. It was breathing again. She pulled her shawl tighter, the cold air crisp in her lungs. She had not come here to die. She had come here to work. She had taken a tomb and, through sheer, bloody-minded pragmatism, was turning it into a fortress. It was hers. She had built it. And as she looked out over the land she was reclaiming, she felt a sense of ownership so fierce and profound it startled her. She had no need of a duke. She was the ruler of her own, small, resilient kingdom. Alistair rode north with the bitterness of defeat clinging to him like road dust. London had chewed him up and spat him out. The political machinations he had once navigated with cold precision had become a poisonous morass. A bill he had championed, one born from the bloody lessons of the war, had been gutted in Parliament by men who valued their purses more than the lives of soldiers. His allies had proven to be cowards, his enemies triumphant. He was exhausted, hollowed out, the echoes of shouting matches in Westminster mingling with the older, darker echoes of cannon fire. He needed silence. He needed a place where no one would speak to him, make demands of him, or look at him with either expectation or pity. He needed a grave to crawl into for a while, a place to be left alone until the man he was supposed to be could reassemble himself. And so he rode for Graymore. He had not thought of the place, or the woman he had sent there, in 2 years. Not once. She had been a problem solved, a loose end tied off and forgotten. He admitted to himself, as his horse picked its way over the increasingly rough terrain, half expected to have received a letter from a local solicitor by now. A polite, black-edged notification of the death of the Duchess of Blackwood. Its absence had been a minor, background sort of puzzle, one he had never bothered to solve. He assumed the local bureaucracy was as dilapidated as the estate itself. He pictured her buried in some forgotten churchyard, her brief, inconvenient tenure as a duchess over. He expected to find the estate in its final throes of collapse. He remembered the reports, the agent's descriptions of rot and ruin. He was seeking that ruin now. It would mirror the ruin in his own soul. He would find a room with a solid roof, a bottle of brandy, and wait for the world to go away. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as expected, was the gate. The last time he had seen it, one half had been a twisted wreck in a ditch. Now, both gates stood tall and straight. They had been stripped of rust, painted a severe, functional black, and rehung on their massive stone pillars. They were closed. He sat on his horse, staring. It was tidy. The sight was so incongruous with his mental image of Graymore that it felt like a hallucination. He dismounted and pushed one of the heavy gates open. It swung smoothly, silently on well-oiled hinges. As he led his horse through, he noticed the second anomaly. The drive. It was no longer a morass of potholes and weeds. The verges had been scythed back, the overhanging branches trimmed, the surface leveled and filled with fresh gravel. It was a clean, clear artery leading into the heart of the estate. The change was so profound it was disorienting. He rode on, a strange sense of unease beginning to prickle at him. He passed the woods that lined the drive. They had been managed. Deadfall had been cleared, stacked neatly for firewood. Through the trees, he could see sunlight reaching the forest floor. This was not neglect. This was husbandry. Then he rounded the final bend, and the house came into view. He pulled his horse to a halt, his mouth slightly agape. It was the same monstrous, sprawling beast of a building, but it was different, changed. The transformation was not one of beautification, but of brutal, practical triage. The entire west wing, the one with the crumbling Tudor facade, was dark and dead. Its windows were neatly and uniformly boarded over, as if a surgeon had amputated a gangrenous limb to save the body. But the rest of the house, the central block and the east wing, was alive. Smoke, thick and white and smelling of wood smoke and roasting meat, curled from half a dozen chimneys. Every window he could see was glazed and whole. The ivy had been hacked away from the stone, leaving pale scars but allowing the walls to breathe. It was still a fortress, grim and gray, but it was no longer a tomb. It was an occupied fortress. He dismounted before the main doors, his mind struggling to process the information his senses were delivering. He had come here, seeking a mausoleum, and had found a bustling barracks. He tied his horse's reins to a newly installed iron ring and walked up the steps. He didn't bother with the knocker. He was the Duke. This was his house. He turned the heavy iron handle and pushed. The door was locked. He stood there for a moment, his hand on the handle, a feeling of utter absurdity washing over him. He was locked out of his own house. He, the Duke of Blackwood, stood on his own doorstep like a common vagrant. He raised his fist and hammered on the thick oak. "Open this door." He heard the sound of bolts being drawn, and the door opened. A woman stood there, a woman he vaguely recognized as the terrified little maid from somewhere. She was older now, her face fuller, her expression not of fear, but of startled competence. She wore a clean, practical apron. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly at his travel-stained appearance. The question was so perfectly, innocently insulting that it left him momentarily speechless. "I'm the Duke of Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl of restrained fury. "And this is my house." The maid's eyes widened in shock. "Your Grace." She dropped into a flustered curtsy. "Forgive me. We were not expecting you." "Evidently," he bit out, striding past her into the hall. The change inside was even more shocking than the change outside. The great hall was still vast and shadowed, but it was clean. The dust cloths were gone. The furniture, though old and worn, had been polished. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the stone walls and banishing the damp chill he remembered so well. The air smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, not mildew and decay. On a large table that had once been shrouded in white, a vase held a spray of autumn leaves and late-blooming roses. It was a small, simple touch, but it spoke of a place that was cared for. A home. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the hall. "Her Grace?" the maid asked, wringing her hands. "She is in the study, Your Grace." As always, he strode down the corridor, his boots loud on the clean flagstones. The door to the study was ajar. He pushed it open and stopped dead on the threshold. The room was the nerve center of the entire operation. Bookshelves lined the walls, but they were organized, the books interspersed with neat stacks of papers and ledger books. Maps of the estate were pinned to one wall, marked with charcoal lines and notes. The large desk that dominated the room was not the pristine and used surface he remembered. It was a field of active engagement, covered in papers, ink pots, and account books. And behind it sat his wife. She was not the pale, sickly creature he had left in the rain. Her hair was still pulled back in a practical knot, but loose strands had escaped to frame a face that was no longer wan and fragile. It was a face of command. There was a smudge of ink on her cheek, another on her finger. Her dress was of the same simple, dark wool, but it fit a frame that was no longer impossibly slender, but lean and strong. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She was magnificent. She looked up as his shadow fell across her desk. Her lucid gray eyes, the one feature he remembered with perfect clarity, widened for a fraction of a second in genuine shock. The pen she was holding froze over the page. She had not expected him. He, in his arrogance, had never considered that his return would be a surprise, an interruption. He stood there, the hollowed-out Duke, a ghost in his own home, staring at the vibrant, powerful woman who had taken his ruin and built a kingdom. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and years of neglect. He was the one who broke it. The only words that came to his mind were blunt, stupid, and accusatory. "You're alive." A beat passed. A slow, ironic smile touched her lips, a smile that did not reach her eyes. She placed her pen down with deliberate care, aligning it perfectly with the edge of a ledger. Then she leaned back in her chair, her gaze cool and appraising, and delivered her response. "I do apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace." The words, delivered with a chilling, polite precision, were a slap in the face. They established everything in a single, devastating blow. Her survival was an act of defiance. His presence was an intrusion, and the power dynamic he had taken for granted had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. He was the Duke. He was the master of this house. But as he stood in the doorway of her study, he felt like nothing more than a trespasser. The confrontation in the study set the tone for the days that followed. Alistair found himself a stranger in his own home, an intruder in a well-oiled machine that ran on a rhythm he did not understand and an authority that was not his. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a title that had commanded armies and swayed parliaments. But within the stone walls of Greymoor, it was a hollow, useless thing. The true ruler was the woman in the study. Her name was Alara. He had to consciously recall it. For 2 years, she'd been a nameless, faceless concept, the wife. Now, she was a constant, unnerving presence. She did not rail at him for his abandonment. She did not demand apologies or explanations. She treated him with a cool, distant, and impeccably correct formality that was more infuriating than any shrewish outburst could have been. She called him Your Grace with a tone that stripped the title of all its power, turning it into a simple, formal address, like Mr. He was given a room in the East Wing, one that was clean and warm, with a fire that was lit every morning and evening. But it felt like a guest room. His presence disrupted the household's routine. At dinner, which they took in a small, formerly unused dining parlor she had reclaimed, the silence was a weapon. She would eat with a focused efficiency, her mind clearly on other matters: the sale of the autumn vegetable surplus, the cost of repairing the southern wall of the garden, the health of a new horse. He would try to assert himself, to reclaim some semblance of his position. "I saw the West Wing has been boarded up," he said one evening, his voice overly loud in the quiet room. A drastic measure. She did not look up from her plate. A practical one. It was a choice between heating a dozen habitable rooms or attempting to heat 300 uninhabitable ones. He chose solvency over sentimentality. "It is the ancestral heart of the house," he countered, feeling foolish even as he said it. The ancestral heart of the house was riddled with rot and threatening to collapse on the rest of the structure, she replied, finally meeting his gaze, her eyes like chips of granite. "I performed an amputation to save the patient. You are welcome to inspect the ledgers, Your Grace. The savings on firewood and repairs alone have funded the restoration of the greenhouses and the purchase of 2 draft horses." She spoke of it as a business, a campaign. And he, who had just come from a failed campaign of his own, had no answer for her success. Every corner he turned, he was confronted by the evidence of her industry and his neglect. The staff was the most galling manifestation of this new world order. They were polite to him, of course. They addressed him as Your Grace. But their loyalty was not his. He saw it in the way Mary, the maid, would glance at Alara for confirmation after he made a request. He saw it in the way Mrs. Gable, the grim housekeeper he vaguely remembered, would bring the morning tea to Alara first. The true battle of wills came with Thorn, the groundsman. Alistair, seeking to re-establish his authority, sought the man out. He found him by the stables, repairing a harness. Alistair began to give an order, something about inspecting the distant woodlands for timber. Thorn listened patiently, his hands never ceasing their work. When Alistair was finished, the groundsman wiped his hands on an oily rag and looked him straight in the eye. "A good idea, Your Grace. I'll mention it to the Duchess. She's the one who draws up the work schedule. We're short-handed as it is, with the last of the harvest." The casual redirection of his authority was absolute. Thorn was not being insubordinate. He was being practical. He was reporting to his actual commander. Alistair was left standing in the stable yard, the Duke of Nowhere, his orders dissolving into thin air. He began to watch her. He would stand in the shadows of the great hall and watch her cross from the study to the kitchens, a sheaf of papers in her hand, her expression focused. She moved with a purpose that he, for the first time in months, found himself envying. She had a war to fight, and she was winning. He was a retired general, haunting the edges of a battlefield where he no longer had a command. His frustration grew, curdling into a sour resentment. Who was this woman to remake his ancestral home? To sell his family's possessions and turn his parkland into a vegetable patch? He had sent her here to fade away, not to build an empire in his absence. Her competence was a constant, silent rebuke to his own failures. The breaking point came a week after his arrival. A storm rolled in from the north, a furious tempest of wind and rain that rattled the window panes and moaned in the chimneys. He was in the library, her library now, neat and ordered, trying to lose himself in a book, but the rage and humiliation were a restless poison in his veins. He heard a commotion in the hall, the sound of her voice, sharp and commanding, and the heavier tread of Thorn's boots. He went to investigate. He found them by the main doors, both soaked to the skin, their faces grim in the firelight. Thorn was holding a shattered piece of slate. "The new patch over the kitchens," Thorn was saying, his voice low and angry. The wind took it clean off. The rain's pouring into the attic space. It'll be through the ceiling before morning. "Mary and Arthur are setting buckets," Elara said, stripping off her wet gloves. Her face was pale with exhaustion and worry. "But if the wind gets under the adjoining slates, we could lose half the roof." This was his chance. A crisis. A moment to be the Duke, the master, the one to take charge. "Thorn," Alistair said, his voice booming with authority. "Get a ladder. We'll need rope and a tarpaulin. I'll not have my kitchen roof collapse." He expected them to jump to his command. Instead, they both just looked at him. Thorn glanced at Elara, waiting. She was the one who answered, her voice edged with a weariness that cut him deeper than any anger. "Your Grace, you're not dressed for climbing on a roof in a gale. Mr. Thorn and I will handle it." "You?" He scoffed, incredulous. "You will be blown off in a minute. This is a man's work." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had made a fatal error. Alara's tired expression hardened into one of cold fury. She took a step towards him, her slender frame radiating an intensity that made him, for the first time, take an involuntary step back. "A man's work?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Was it a man's work that found the money to buy the slate in the first place? Was it a man's work that organized the laborers and oversaw the repairs? "For 2 years, this has been my work. This house, this roof, this land. It has all been on my shoulders. I have fought for every stone of it while you were in London, playing your important games. You have been here a week, and you dare to tell me what is and is not my concern." She was magnificent, soaked, furious, and utterly in command. "This is still my house," he managed to say, the words sounding weak and petulant even to his own ears. "Is it?" She shot back. "You abandoned it. You left it to die, just as you left me to die. You have no right to it. You have no right to come back here, broken and defeated, and try to play the lord of the manor in the fortress I built from your ruins. You are a guest here, Your Grace. A guest, and you are in the way." She turned her back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Thorn," she said, her voice once again the crisp tone of command. The tarpaulin is in the old stables. Let's go. Thorn gave Alistair a single, brief look. It was not a look of triumph or insolence. It was a look of something that might have been pity. Then he turned and followed his Duchess out into the raging storm. Alistair stood alone in the great hall, the firelight flickering on his face. The sound of the wind and rain seemed to mock him. She had not just challenged his authority. She had stripped it from him, laid it bare as a meaningless vanity. She had told him the truth, a truth he had been running from for months. He was broken, he was defeated, and he was utterly, completely useless. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just broken inside him. The storm raged all night, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had been unleashed within Greymoor's walls. Alistair did not go back to the library. He could not sit still. Alara's words echoed in his head, each one a perfectly aimed blow. You abandoned it. You left it to die, just as you left me to die. You're a guest here. The truth of it was a bitter acid in his gut. He had retreated to Greymoor seeking a quiet grave, and had instead walked into his own judgment. He paced the length of the great hall, the wind howling down the massive chimney, making the flames in the hearth leap and dance. He could hear the storm's fury battering the roof and walls, and with every gust, he pictured Alara and Thorn on that slippery, treacherous roof, fighting to save a part of the home she had built. The image was galling. He, the Duke, a man who had led cavalry charges, was pacing uselessly by a fire while his wife, his fragile, disposable wife, did the dangerous work. The hours crawled by. Sometime after midnight, the main door opened and Thorn entered, staggering with exhaustion. He was soaked through, his face streaked with grime, but he carried himself with the satisfaction of a job done. It's done, Your Grace, he said, addressing Alistair but clearly reporting the outcome. The tarpaulin is secure. It'll hold till this blows over. The Duchess, she's a rare one. Nerves of iron. He shook his head in weary admiration. She's seeing to the horses. Sent me in to get dry. Alistair just nodded, unable to form a reply. Alara was still out there, still working. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He felt a sudden, desperate need to do something, anything, to erase the stain of his own uselessness. He went to the kitchen. The cooks had long since gone to bed, but a kettle had been left on the hob, and the fire in the great cooking hearth was banked low. On impulse, he added wood to the fire, found the tea caddy, and measured out tea into a pot. The simple, domestic act felt foreign and absurd. A duke making tea. It was a measure of how far his world had tilted off its axis. When he returned to the great hall, a steaming pot in his hand, she was there. She stood before the fire, her back to him, her wet cloak dripping onto the stone floor. She had not removed it, as if the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she could not bear to part with the sodden wool. Her shoulders were slumped with an exhaustion so profound it seemed the only thing holding her upright was sheer force of will. The fury was gone from her, replaced by a frightening stillness. As he watched, a tremor ran through her, a violent shiver that shook her entire frame. She was not just tired, she was spent. The campaign to save Greymoor, the constant battle against decay and bankruptcy, had taken its toll, and tonight's fight had drained her reserves completely. He said nothing. He walked over to the table and poured the tea into 2 cups. The clink of the porcelain against the saucer was loud in the charged silence. He picked up one of the cups and walked towards her. "Drink this," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its ducal command. It was a simple request. She did not turn. "I don't need your tea, Your Grace. You're freezing," he stated. "You will make yourself ill." The irony of his concern was not lost on him. He, who had sent her here expecting her to succumb to illness, was now worried about her health. Another shiver racked her body. "My health is my own concern. It always has been." He moved to stand beside her, holding the cup out. The steam rose from it, carrying the scent of bergamot and warmth. "Alara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It felt strange on his tongue. "Please, just drink the tea." She was silent for a long moment. Then, with a slow, weary movement, she turned her head. In the firelight, her face was deathly pale, her eyes huge and dark in their sockets. The formidable commander who had faced him down hours earlier was gone. In her place was a woman on the very edge of collapse. Her hand, when she reached for the cup, was trembling uncontrollably. He had to guide it to her lips, his own hand steadying hers. She took a sip, then another. The hot liquid seemed to momentarily halt the shivering. She leaned her head back against the stone mantelpiece, her eyes closing. She looked fragile enough to shatter. And in that moment, seeing her stripped of her armor of competence and defiance, Alistair felt something shift within him. The resentment, the bruised pride, the anger, it all fell away, replaced by a raw, shocking wave of something else. A desperate, protective instinct he had not felt for anyone or anything in a very long time. He had seen men break on the battlefield. He had seen them push themselves past every limit of endurance until their bodies and minds simply gave out. He recognized the signs. She was at that breaking point, and it was his fault, not just for the argument, but for the entire 2-year war she had been fighting alone. The storm that had been battering the house began to intensify. A deafening clap of thunder shook the very foundations of Greymoor, so loud and close it sounded like an artillery barrage. Alistair froze. The sound was a key, unlocking a door in his mind he kept permanently bolted. The great hall dissolved. The smell of wood smoke became the acrid stench of gunpowder. The howling wind became the shriek of incoming shells. He was no longer in Northumberland. He was back on a muddy field in Belgium, the sky ripped open by fire, the ground shaking with the death of 100 men. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He could not breathe. The world narrowed to a single point of unbearable terror. He must have made some sound, a choked gasp, because he was dimly aware of Alara's eyes snapping open. He saw her look at him, her own exhaustion forgotten, her expression shifting from weariness to alarm. "Your Grace?" she said, her voice sounding very far away. Alistair, he could not answer. He was drowning in the memory, his body convinced it was about to be annihilated. He stumbled back from the fire, his hand going to his side as if searching for a sword that was not there. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The carefully constructed walls of the Duke of Blackwood, the cold, detached commander, had not just been breached, they had been obliterated. Another clap of thunder, closer this time, and a strangled cry was torn from his throat. He was lost. Then a hand was on his arm. A small, cool hand, but its grip was surprisingly firm. Grounding. He flinched at the touch, but it did not retreat. Alistair, it was Alara's voice, close to his ear now, low and steady. It cut through the phantom noise of battle. "It's the storm. It's just the storm. You are at Greymoor. You are in the Great Hall." He shook his head, unable to escape the sensory onslaught of the past. "The guns," he rasped, the words tasting of ash. "They're getting closer." "No," she said, her voice firm, practical. She did not sound afraid of him. She sounded like a doctor diagnosing a fever. "There are no guns. Listen to me. Listen to my voice. That sound is thunder. And the roof over the kitchens is leaking. Thorne says the water is coming down near the west wall, and I am concerned it will damage the new flour sacks." "The flour sacks, Alistair. Do you hear me? We cannot afford to lose that flour. Flour sacks. Leaking roof. Thorne." The words were solid, mundane, real. They were anchors, and she was throwing them to him, one by one, into the violent sea of his memory. He clung to them. He forced himself to focus on her voice, on the pressure of her hand on his arm. "The south field needs to be plowed before the first hard frost," she continued, her tone even and relentless. "Thorne thinks the new horse has a stone in its shoe. The price of candles went up a penny in the village. Mrs. Gable is complaining about the quality of the beeswax." She was talking about her world. Her practical, solid, real world of repairs and harvests and household complaints. She was pulling him out of the hell of his past and into the difficult, tangible present of her life. Slowly, agonizingly, The sound of the cannons began to fade, replaced by the howl of the wind. The smell of gunpowder gave way to the scent of rain and wood smoke. His breathing steadied. The trembling in his limbs subsided. He looked down at her. She was still pale, still exhausted, but her lucid gray eyes were fixed on his, clear and unwavering. She had seen him completely undone, had witnessed the raw, terrified man beneath the ducal armor. And she had not run. She had not pitted him. She had grounded him. In the quiet space between the thunderclaps, he saw her. He truly saw her for the first time, not as a transaction, not as a rival for power, but as a person of impossible, pragmatic strength. She had faced his demons with the same practicality with which she faced a leaking roof. The crisis had come, but it had not been the one he expected. The storm had not broken her. It had broken him, and she, the woman he had sent to this desolate place to die, had been the one to hold him together. The storm blew itself out before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. The only sounds are the steady drip of water from the eaves and the tired sigh of the wind. Inside the great hall, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on the two silent figures who had kept vigil through the night. Alistair sat in one of the large armchairs, a thick blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Alaris sat in the chair opposite, her wet cloak finally discarded, another blanket draped over her. They had not spoken since the thunder had faded. She had simply stayed, her presence a quiet, anchoring weight in the darkness. She had refilled his cup with tea, and then her own, and they had sat in a silence that was no longer a weapon, but a shared space of exhaustion and fragile truce. He felt exposed, flayed open. The ducal armor he had worn for so long had been shattered, and he did not know how to piece it back together. The shame of his breakdown was a raw, tender thing. He, who prided himself on his control, had been reduced to a gasping, terrified child by a clap of thunder. And she had seen it all. He watched her in the dim light. She seemed to have shrunk into herself, the formidable energy she normally projected drawn inward. The line of her shoulders was still tense, but the fierce, combative spark in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, profound weariness. They were two soldiers, he thought, in the aftermath of a battle that had left them both wounded and spent. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the high-arched windows, she finally stirred. She pushed herself to her feet with the stiff movements of someone whose every muscle ached. She walked to the window and looked out at the damp, bruised landscape. "The rain has stopped," she said, her voice quiet and husky. "Yes," he replied. It seemed a ridiculously inadequate thing to say. She turned from the window and looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. There was no pity in it, for which he was grateful, but there was no condemnation either. There was just a calm, clear-eyed assessment. "I should see to the roof," she said, more to herself than to him. "It can wait," he heard himself say. "Thorn will see to it. You need to rest." A faint, tired smile touched her lips. "Rest is a luxury the accounts do not currently allow for. Your Grace," she was already slipping back in her role, the formal address a shield she was raising between them. "Alistair," he corrected her, the name feeling clumsy. "My name is Alistair." She considered this for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She walked not towards the door, but towards the kitchen. He rose and followed her. He did not know why. He only knew he could not bear the thought of being left alone in the great hall with the ghosts of the night. The kitchen was cold and quiet. Without a word, she went to the great hearth, knelt down, and began to skillfully build the fire back up from the embers. He stood by, feeling large and useless, watching her deft, practical movements. She worked with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. "The accounts," he said, breaking the silence. "The ones you spoke of. I wish to see them." She paused, a piece of kindling in her hand. "Why?" The question was not accusatory, merely curious. "You said I was broken and defeated," he said, the words costing him a great deal of his remaining pride. "You were right. I failed in London, but I was not always a failure. Before politics, I was a soldier. And before that, I studied engineering. I understand structures, stresses, logistics. Perhaps I can be of some use here." It was the closest he could come to an apology, an admission of his own inadequacy and a grudging acknowledgement of her competence. It was an offering, a confession of weakness. She did not mock him. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply looked at him for a long moment, then nodded again. "The ledgers are in the study. The reports on the structural survey of the East Wing are on the top left of the desk. They make for grim reading." It was acceptance, pragmatic and unsentimental. She was not offering him pity. She was offering him a job. The fire caught, and she filled the kettle and set on the hob. As they waited for the water to boil, a new dynamic began to form in the quiet, shared space. The tension of the power struggle had dissipated, replaced by a tentative, fragile curiosity. Later that morning, he found himself in the study, the ledger spread before him. He had expected to be bored by the columns of figures, but he was fascinated. It was a campaign history, detailing every small victory, every strategic retreat. He saw the sale of the porcelain figurines that paid for the greenhouse glass. He saw the careful budgeting for seed and tools. He saw the meticulous records of the vegetable sales, the small but steady trickle of income that was breathing life back into the estate. It was brilliant, a masterpiece of logistical planning born from sheer desperation. He moved on to the structural surveys. She was right, they were grim. He saw notes in her neat, precise hand in the margins, questioning the surveyor's conclusions, proposing alternative, less expensive solutions for reinforcing a sagging floor joist or repointing a crumbling wall. He was so absorbed that he did not hear her enter. He looked up to find her standing there, holding a tray with 2 cups and a plate of bread and cheese. She placed it on a clear corner of the desk. "Thorne reports the tarpaulin held," she said. "The damage is minimal." "Good," he replied, his eyes drawn back to a diagram of the roof trusses. "This surveyor is an idiot. He's proposing replacing this entire king post. It's unnecessary. A sister beam and a steel brace would be twice as strong at 1/10 of the cost." She came to stand behind him, leaning over to look at the paper. He was acutely aware of her closeness, the faint scent of soap and rain-washed air that clung to her. Her finger traced the line he was indicating. "I thought so as well," she said, "but I did not know the correct terminology." "A sister beam," she said the words as if tasting them. "I can draw up the plans," he offered, "and show Thorne how to fabricate the brace in the old forge." "The forge hasn't been used in 50 years, she said. "The bellows can be repaired. The anvil will still be sound," he replied, a flicker of his old, confident self returning. This was a problem he could solve. A tangible, physical problem, not the shadowy betrayals of politics. And so, the partnership began. It was not a partnership of husband and wife, but of engineer and administrator. He spent his days with Thorne, wrestling with the practical challenges of the decaying house. He rediscovered the satisfaction of working with his hands, of seeing a direct result from his labor. He helped repair the forge, his ducal hands stained with grease and soot. He taught Thorne the principles of leverage to move a fallen chimney stack. He found a strange, grounding peace in the physical exhaustion at the end of the day. She, in turn, began to consult him. She would bring him problems, a dispute with a tenant farmer, a contract for the sale of winter cabbages, a proposal for leasing some of the rough grazing land for sheep. He found that his experience in negotiation and law, honed in the cutthroat world of London, was a valuable asset. He could spot a loophole in a contract, suggest a firmer negotiating position. They worked, often in silence, in the shared space of the study, the scratch of her pen and the rustle of his papers a comfortable, companionable sound. One afternoon, while they were reviewing a map of the estate, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same spot. A jolt, a flicker of awareness, passed between them. It was not romantic. It was a simple, grounding moment of physical contact, an acknowledgement of their shared presence, their shared work. The silence between them, once a battlefield, had become a truce. A quiet, comfortable space where 2 lonely, damaged people could work side by side, building something new from the wreckage of the old. The house was no longer his or hers. It was theirs, and in the shared struggle to save it, they were, without realizing it, beginning to save each other. The truce held through the autumn and into the first bite of winter. A quiet rhythm established itself at Graymore, a rhythm of shared work and comfortable silence. Alistair found a purpose that had nothing to do with titles or politics. It was in the solid feel of a well-mended stone wall, the clean lines of a new plan for drainage, the grudging respect in Thorne's eyes when a difficult repair was completed. He was no longer the haunted Duke seeking a grave. He was the estate's resident engineer. Alara, for her part, found the crushing weight of sole responsibility beginning to lift. Alistair's presence had become not a threat, but a support. His sharp legal mind saved them from a disadvantageous timber contract. His knowledge of architecture prevented them from making a costly mistake in the restoration of the East Wing's roof. She found herself sleeping more soundly, the constant, gnawing anxiety about the estate's survival easing its grip. He was a partner. It was a new and unsettling concept, but a welcome one. They were a team. The staff, who had at first been wary of the Duke's presence, now accepted it as the new reality. They saw him mucking out a blocked culvert with Thorne, his fine coat discarded, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. They heard his quiet, technical discussions with the Duchess in the study. He was not playing at being a lord, he was working, and at Graymore, work was the only currency that mattered. The change was most evident in the evenings. After a simple, hearty dinner, they would retire to the study. A fire would be roaring in the hearth. She would sit at her desk, finalizing the next day's orders or balancing the weekly accounts. He would sit in a large armchair, reviewing architectural drawings or reading a book on crop rotation. They rarely spoke, but the silence was a warm, shared blanket against the cold and the dark. He was an intruder no more. He was a fixture. This quiet, fragile peace was shattered on a bitterly cold afternoon in late November. A rider appeared on the gravel drive, his horse steaming in the frigid air. He was not a local. He wore the livery of the king's messengers, and the leather pouch at his side bore the royal crest. Alara saw him from the study window. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced the newfound comfort of her life. The outside world had found them. The world that had discarded her and broken him had come calling. The courier was brought into the great hall, his boots leaving damp prints on the stone floor. He was young, arrogant, and impressed with his own importance. He bowed stiffly, his eyes sweeping the hall with a disdainful air. "A dispatch for His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood," he announced, his voice ringing with the authority of the capital. "From the Lord Chamberlain. Urgent." Alistair came from the direction of the kitchens, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been helping Thorne brace a cellar wall. There was a smudge of dirt on his jaw, and his hair was disheveled. He looked nothing like the formidable political operator the courier had likely expected. He took the leather pouch, broke the wax seal, and unrolled the parchment. Alara watched him from the doorway of the study, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She could not hear the rustle of the paper from where she stood, but she could see the change in him as he read. The easy, tired lines of the working man vanished. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened. The mask of the Duke of Blackwood, cold, commanding, and burdened, settled back onto his features. The past had reached out and reclaimed him. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute and devastating, that he would leave. Of course he would leave. He was a duke. His life was one of duty, of politics, of power. This interlude at Graymore, this strange, quiet partnership, had been nothing more than a convalescence, a temporary retreat. She had been a fool to think it could be anything more. Her own walls, the ones she had so cautiously, so partially lowered, slammed back into place. The defensive instincts that had kept her alive for so long took over. She felt the warmth of the past few months drain away, leaving behind the familiar, icy chill of self-reliance. He finished reading and rolled the parchment back up. He looked up, and his eyes found hers across the hall. He saw the change in her instantly. The open, collaborative partner of that morning was gone. In her place stood the Duchess of Graymore, the ruler of her own kingdom, her expression a mask of cool, impenetrable formality. She was already preparing for his departure. She was already erasing him. "Your Grace will be requiring a horse, I presume," she said, her voice the same chillingly polite tone she had used when he first arrived. "And a packed meal. The journey to London is long, and the inns are unreliable at this time of year." She was dismissing him, managing his exit with the same efficiency she managed everything else. She was making it easy for him to go, protecting herself from the pain of watching him choose his old life over the new one they had begun to build. The courier watched the exchange, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw what he expected to see, a great lord being called back to his important duties, his provincial wife making the necessary arrangements. Alistair looked from the dispatch in his hand to the woman in the doorway. He saw the hurt she was trying so desperately to hide behind her mask of cold competence. He saw the fortress she had rebuilt around herself in the space of a single minute. He saw the life he had in London, the endless, draining battles, the hollow victories, the soul-crushing compromises. And he saw the life he had here, the solid reality of stone and earth, the satisfaction of tangible work, the quiet, grounding presence of this impossible, magnificent woman. He had come to Graymore seeking a place to die. Instead, he had found a reason to live. He made his choice. He turned away from Alara and walked towards the great hall's massive fireplace. The courier and Alara watched, confused, as he stood before the roaring flames. He held the royal dispatch in his hand, the summons back to his old life, his old self. And he dropped it into the fire. The parchment curled instantly, the edges blackening before the wax seal melted, and the whole thing erupted in a bright, brief flare of orange flame. It was gone in seconds, turned to nothing but a wisp of smoke and a flutter of black ash up the chimney. It was an act of treason, an act of rebellion. It was a declaration. He turned back, his face grim but resolute. He looked first at the stunned courier. "Return to London," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Tell the Lord Chamberlain that the Duke of Blackwood is indisposed. He is overseeing the repairs to his estate. It is a matter of great importance and will require his full attention for the foreseeable future." The courier's jaw dropped. He stared at Alistair as if he had gone mad. "But, Your Grace, the king's business. The king has 1,000 servants." Alistair cut him off. "This house has only 2. My duty is here." He dismissed the man with a curt nod, and then turned his full attention to Alara. She had not moved from the doorway. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. Her mask of composure had cracked, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a fragile, terrified hope. He walked slowly towards her, closing the distance across the stone floor. He stopped in front of her, so close he could see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He had rejected his title, his duty, his past. Now, he had to make her understand why. "You were wrong," he said, his voice low and intense, meant only for her. "When I first came here, you told me I had no right to this house. You were right. I had abandoned it. But I have worked for it. I have bled for it, and I will not abandon it again." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take one of her clenched fists in his hand. He uncurled her stiff, cold fingers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand where the skin was rough from work. "My duty is no longer to a king in a distant city. It is to the roof over our heads, to the fields that feed us, to the home we are building from the ruins." He looked directly into her wide, lucid eyes, and he laid his own soul bare. "This is my home now, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had long thought himself incapable of feeling. "You are my home." At his words, the last of her defenses did not just fall. They evaporated. The iron control she had maintained for a lifetime shattered. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and the tears she had refused to shed for years finally came. They were not tears of sadness or despair, but of overwhelming, terrifying relief. She did not collapse. She did not fall into his arms. She simply leaned forward, her body trembling, and rested her forehead against his chest. It was a gesture of utter surrender, of trust so absolute it stole his breath. He could feel the tremors running through her, the culmination of a life of struggle and solitude, finally finding a place to rest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her carefully, as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. But she was not fragile. She was the strongest person he had ever known. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and winter air, and held her tight. Outside, the first snowflakes of the coming winter had begun to fall, soft and silent against the gray stone of the house. But inside the great hall, two damaged, solitary people stood together, no longer alone. They were a permanent fixture against the coming cold, a quiet, unshakable union in the heart of the house they had resurrected together. A house that was at long last fiercely alive and completely whole.